Well, Phil, the book is God's Adversary and Ours, A Brief Theology of the Devil. This is my take on it, but I could be wrong on this. It seems like many modern theologians, pastors too, especially, are reluctant to speak of the devil at all. Is that accurate? And if it is, why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's part of my own motivation, I think, kind of lying back behind the the project, a kind of negative motivation, I suppose, and awareness that time and time again, if you're tracking, say, the lectionary readings, as one might do in a Presbyterian church here in Scotland or similar kinds of places elsewhere, the lectionary will present you with texts in which the figure of the devil appears in one way or another, whether in the Gospels or in the Pauline epistles or elsewhere in the New Testament, especially, but also in Job and other places too. And it is striking to me how rarely, when I hear those passages preached, the place of the devil in the text gets any mention whatsoever.
Okay.
Um, it's yeah, it's a preacher's prerogative, of course, not to say everything at once, but it is clear that the devil is a sort of embarrassment to us, and yet it is a kind of ubiquitous figure um, throughout the pages of the New Testament in a way which does make it difficult to avoid. Um, and I suppose that awkward, embarrassed silence about the devil was a phenomena which I've noted over the years, and to which the book is a bit of a response. I suppose the other thing to which the book is a response is a worry that in in that silence about the devil, all kinds of sort of irresponsible um, thinking and speaking about the, the devil and related themes can kind of flow, right? That in the vacuum created by that silence, all manner of irresponsible theological talk or sub theological talk can kind of thrive. And so I think part of what I was hoping for with the book is to push into that space with some content
Okay.
uh, in a way that, if I'm lucky, might help us to displace some of the most irresponsible things that go on in the silence about the devil in the church.
Okay. That makes sense. You subtitled the book A Brief Theology of the Devil. Why the word brief? Was it
Yeah,
stylistic choice or publisher choice, a theological
uh,
choice?
yeah. So it was the subtitle was also the subtitle that I used for the lectures from which the book arose, the 2024 Warfield lectures, which I gave at Princeton Theological Seminary in that spring. And yeah, brief, of course, in one meaning, simply a reference to the length of the book, which is not that long. It's only kind of just under 200 pages, and that's partially by virtue of a kind of practical constraint. It's kind of 6 1-hour lectures worked up into a book length study makes for something quite brief. But there is something I think also principled about the brevity. Um, it's it's been kind of famously said by a number of theologians. The example I have in my head is Karl Barth, for example, that too much or too extended an interest in questions of evil, sin, the devil on the part of a Christian theologian has a kind of important distorting effect, which is to be resisted. And um, Barth's own treatment of the devil, for example, in the course of the Church Dogmatics, is very spare, substantive but spare, and he makes the explicit point in setting that treatment up that the devil can really only be looked at kind of sideways and in passing, um, uh, precisely because it is, um, uh, yeah, precisely because of the character of the problem of evil, which the of which the devil is the figure. So there's something quite appropriate about the brevity of a study, and I did want to honor that kind of principle in the way I've gone about it. Another way to think of it might be to say that in fact you could read the book as a kind of negative Christology, right? Its primary and proper subject is in fact the person and work of Christ. And because it's a Christology, uh, and because of the way the devil figures in the rendering of the identity and work of Christ in the New Testament, the devil appears as a kind of negative correlate or a sort of shadowy enemy, as I adopt the grammar in the book, of the figure of Christ. So the primary subject in a Christology, of which the devil is a kind of necessary corollary, but a corollary. And so should never be treated in a way that makes it seem as though the devil is sort of equally as interesting and equally as important, for example, as the figure of Christ would be.
Yeah, I mean, you do a really good job in the book of showing that, which I'd never thought of before, but of the kind of negative Christology. Appreciated kind of reading and trying to understand that. What do
Hmm.
you hope readers will unlearn or even relearn about the devil through this book?
Hmm. That's a good question. Um, I think on the unlearning side, I think, as we've already mentioned, I would love for the sort of embarrassed silence about the devil, the hesitancy to speak to the role of the figure as it appears in the text of the New Testament. I would love for that silence to be overcome. So that's sort of one thing. If we could unlearn our embarrassment in this regard, it would be, I think, a good thing. Um, I think another thing is one of the cases that I make in the book is that when the theological tradition has treated the devil as it has done from the beginning, um, it's typically done so in what I call in the book as a shorthand within the context of the first article of the creed. So in close relation to doctrines of creation and providence, and at some remove from the concerns of what we sometimes call the second article of the creed. So those doctrines which are associated most directly with the person and work of Christ, the business of salvation. So the figure of the devil is treated, when it's treated at all, in relation to high level questions about divine providence, about the role of evil in the course of providence, about the fall of angels. So the uh, the work of the devil is often tied up with one's angelology, sometimes even exhaustively so. Um, one of the cases which I'm trying to make in the book is that it would be good and useful for us to kind of relocate our thinking about the devil out of that uh, the confines of the first article, um, and those closer relationships with providence and angelology and so on, and to move it more firmly into the heart of the second article of the creed. Um, and so if unlearning that traditional placement is one thing, I guess kind of learning again or learning afresh the this alternative location um, is, I think, one of the things I would love to recommend by way of the book. So to say that differently, um, my proposal is that we do best to think about the devil theologically within the doctrines of salvation, precisely because it's in the closest possible relation to the appearance and work of Christ that the figure of the devil is most manifest in the scriptural witness. There's something appropriate, it seems to me, about thinking and speaking about the devil in the closest possible proximity to our thinking and speaking about the person and work of Christ. And so that discipline of trying to think again about the devil in that concrete relationship with the person and work of Christ, rather than in the context of other doctrines, is kind of the wager of the book. So yeah, so I think in terms of things that I would be hopeful that readers might come to learn would be, I hope they might come to share my sense of the value of that relocation of our thought and speech of the devil um, from its traditional place in the first article into this, I guess, revisionist place, the context of the second.
Could you speak theologically in terms of how you would define the devil? Satan being, a power, personified symbol of evil.
Yeah. So these kinds of questions about the identity and the agency and the being of the devil are the kind of big dogmatic questions, aren't they? Right? What exactly is the devil,
Mhm.
how ought we to conceive of of him. Um, what I what I try to do in the book is to build up a kind of portrait of the devil across the three main uh, chapters that make up the core, sort of 3, 4, and 5. And in doing that, I I sort of choose by design to defer these questions about being and identity and agency until the final chapter in chapter 6. And I want to do that because my my hunch is that the devil takes shape. So the grounds for answering these questions well will be displayed precisely by the kind of exegetical rediscovery of the way the devil features in the narration of the work of Christ. And I build up that work, as you'll know, having read the book. I I take the threefold title that John's Gospel gives us of Christ as the way, the truth, and the life, and I explore in each of those central chapters the way in which the devil appears as the opponent and enemy of Christ as the life, or Christ as the way, or indeed Christ as the truth. Um, and it's only in in that concrete opposition, I think, that we come to see whatever the devil is, uh, and we see that by paying attention to what the devil does. So the the argument of the book tends to emphasize the activity of the devil, especially this oppositional activity, um, the kind of adversarial reality, and only having done that, then across these three main chapters, do I kind of venture to say something about what I think the devil sort of is. By the time I get there, I found myself wanting to say things that are perhaps not as clear and straightforward as readers might like. I have a hunch that we might do best to speak of the devil's being as a kind of the kind of being which isn't any real being, except in its opposition to the person and work of Christ. So it has no proper being of its own. It's not properly a creature, certainly not properly a God, um, but the kind of thing which only exists in the event of its opposing the work of grace. It only exists in and as its opposition to the outworking of the divine purposes. It's a kind of being in opposition, right? And apart from its opposition, it's nothing, right? So there's that final chapter reaches for language of nothingness, which is a category which has been used in modern theology to try to characterize something of this. It brings my discussion into proximity with some elements of the work of Karl Barth at that point, who also found that a congenial kind of term for trying to express this strange kind of not exactly straightforward ontology of the opponent of God. Um, and I really want to emphasize that if we learn about the character, the agency, and therefore also the identity and being of the devil from paying close attention to this uh, anti-salvific activity, that we should and we will find ourselves having to speak in this awkward kind of way about a being that is really no being at all, or a being which only has being kind of parasitically, right? The longer theological tradition, as you'll know, I'm sure, tends to want to speak about evil with the language of privation, right? So evil isn't anything; it's the kind of lack of things, right? It's the absence of something, of the absence of good, for example. So evil is not a kind of alternative substance kind of thing in itself, but it's the absence of its opposite, in this case, good. And that the account that I give of the being of the devil at the end is a kind of version of that primitive account of evil. It really does see the devil as no thing, right? It's not a thing in the world, and also only what it is in its opposition to the good. So it doesn't have any proper being to itself. It only, as it were, kind of exists in the event of its opposition. So it's kind of entirely parasitic. Um, and and isn't anything apart from that opposition. So it only exists in the event of resistance, as it were. And that it's difficult to speak about something
Sure. Yeah.
that has that kind of strange sort of being. And so the final chapter ventures some not altogether happy ways of trying to speak about it as a kind of anarchic being, kind of being that doesn't have any proper telos or proper origin. Um, as a kind of an ontological being, like I've been trying to express here, a being whose reality, such as it is only in opposition and never apart from that opposition, never anything other than that opposition, or if you'd rather, just exhausted in the opposition. So yeah, some verbiage that tries to bring expression to these sorts of very strange things, which I think we need to say if we want to kind of capture the quality of the devil as a kind of strange third thing in the drama of salvation.
Would this theology of nothingness, would that be breaking from, things like patristic fathers or Augustinian, kind of traditional historical Christian thinking, or would this be an extension of most of those guys' theology?
Yeah, so I think in some ways the argument of the book is a kind of revisitation and a kind of recovery of certain classical insights. For example, this one that we've just been discussing about the privative character of evil. I think that the strange logic of privation is one which you meet first in early church fathers. Augustine, for example, has an extended kind of account of it, which runs through the tradition, and I find myself working with that quite openly. At the same time, I speak in the book about the project as a kind of uh, pursuing a minority report in the tradition that the majority story of the Bible, sorry, the majority story of the devil in the tradition is one which quite readily identifies the devil as a fallen angel, ascribes to the devil all the qualities that angels have in terms of the way we think about um, traditionally angelic being, action, knowing, willing, and so on. Imagines that kind of creature in a fallen state, and chiefly assimilates the work of the devil, I think, to the pattern of Job, right? The way that we meet the Satan figure in Job, a figure who is clearly superintended firmly by divine providence, and is despite his nefarious intentions, despite those intentions, is always clearly an instrument of divine good. Right? So all kinds of different strategies are involved in trying to explain how that might be. Pedagogical accounts of needing to learn justice by confronting injustice, or acquiring a taste for the good by seeing it opposed by evil, or so on. So that majority report is one with which the book does take issue. So it is a revisionist account of the doctrine in that sense. Oops, sorry.
Are you still there? Did you lose me?
Yeah, sorry. I pressed a button and
Okay.
something something started playing in my ears.
Okay.
Um, so sorry. Let me just
Oh, all good.
wind that back. So yeah, sorry. I'm not used to these are new iPods and I've never used
Okay.
them before, and they fall out, and whenever I touch them, they do things. So sorry, that was playing something. So let me just wind it back. So you had asked about the, whether it's in continuity or
Yeah,
discontinuity
yeah,
with
yeah.
the tradition. Yeah, and I was just saying that the book is it is a revisionist project in the sense that I think I'd like to encourage us to take leave of that traditional picture which I've just described in favor of something slightly stranger, which emerges when we start our thinking from the Gospels and tether it to the figure who we meet in that series of concrete oppositions to Christ. So, yes, it is a kind of revisionist project, which I think does stand a little sideways to some of the elements of the tradition, even as it runs in continuity with others, like, for example, the basic logic of the primitive doctrine of evil and so on. Yeah.
Sorry, I muted there. how does, you don't necessarily tackle this in the book, but could I, just as I have you, could I ask you this? How does that revisionist kind of perspective play back on the Genesis, 1 to 3 kind of account of the
Mm,
devil? This theology of nothingness, but this personification there in Genesis. Uh,
right.
can I ask just personally, how do you, I don't know,
Yeah.
reconcile, flatten
Yep.
those?
No, sure. So one of the puzzles of I think any doctrine of the devil um, is a biblical puzzle, and that is uh, given the prominence of the discourse of the devil in the New Testament, what do we make of the relative silence about the devil in the texts of the Old? So, for example, you'll know there are but a handful of references to figures like Satan, Job being the most concentrated description, of course, but there are a couple, not one in Zechariah and a handful of others. And then, of course, there's this classic association of the devil with the figure of the snake in the garden. The text of Genesis itself never speaks of the devil, just speaks of the snake as a snake. um, so, but by traditional exegesis, the devil is associated with that work of temptation. That's the so that puzzle caught my eye too. As I was sort of doing the research on it, and it is one of the puzzles which I was keen to reflect on in the course of the argument. The place where I land, this is kind of indirect way of answering your question, is I think what strikes me is that the um, the the most important precursor or kind of type of the figure of the devil as it appears in the text of the Gospels, it seems to me anyway, um, is not so much the Satan of Job, even the kind of providential member of the heavenly court and tempter, the kind of prosecutor, um, nor even, although less less contentiously perhaps, the figure of the snake in the garden, but more straightforwardly, the Pharaoh of the Exodus narratives. I think the idea that the devil appears as an opponent of the saving work of God, that opposition is expressed in violence towards the people of God, and that the work of God is liberation, redemption, rescue out from under the captivity of the power of that opponent. That form, that the shape of that narrative, its form is most evident, I think, in the story of the Exodus, right? So I think for me, the most interesting and instructive comparisons between New Testament and Old Testament on this theme are, in fact, just those comparisons, right? The way in which the figure of the devil in the New Testament emerges as the kind of pharaoh of the world. I cite one of the ancient church fathers who actually speaks that way, right? Sort of discerning, no doubt, this kind of parallel. Certainly, what you get, I mean, in terms of the action of the devil, um, the role of the serpent as a tempter, right, is an important one, and which does have firm connections with the role of the devil in the New Testament. Of course, the confrontation between Christ and the devil in the wilderness is the great kind of confrontation of the Messiah with precisely with temptation, and the form of that temptation is actually identical, isn't it, to the form of the temptation to which is ascribed to the snake, right? A kind of hermeneutical or interpretive temptation, right? So the language of the snake, right? Is it really true that God said, you know, did did what God said really mean what you think it meant? Right. So kind of the hermeneut's question, the interpreter's question, and that's interestingly exactly the pattern of questioning which Christ and the devil go in for in the wilderness, right? Scripture citations which are then argued about, right? Did God really mean, right,
Yeah, that's
for
a
you
good
to be the
point.
Messiah in this way, right? Isn't there another way in which you could pursue the work of the Messiah other than this, right? Maybe through political power, maybe through feeding the masses. These are kind of options, and Christ retorts are invocations of the law, right? Um, uh, which amount to contrary interpretations, right, of the shape and possibilities of the outworking of the righteousness of the Messiah. So yeah, it's interesting to me that the primary between the Genesis snake um, of the devil is that pattern of interpretation. So if I were going to kind of work away on that, I think that would be the piece which would be I'd be keenest to kind of draw out.
You make it your point. I mean that in that Genesis account that he's not named explicitly. Could you just data wise give people an idea? And I think you do a lot of this in the book, but like, uh, what's the comparison of Old Testament, explicit identifications of the devil and New Testament?
Oh yeah. So I I won't give you numbers, but I will point you to an article. There's an article called "Devilish Data," which is a sort of
Okay.
statistical account, actually, of the textual distribution of names and words and titles which are associated with the figure of the devil across the body of the scriptures. It's in the bibliography of the book. It's a very interesting kind of thing, precisely because it shows that apart from a handful of citations in the Old Testament, like you could literally count them on one hand, which refer again never to the word devil itself is actually is a later coinage. So we do get talk of the Satan, right?
Okay.
The tempter in Job, Zechariah. It's a passage somewhere in the Torah histories as well, which uses the language, though it's not exactly clear that it refers to a figure or a kind of agent in quite the same way. Very few. By contrast, talk about the devil, the Satan, the God of this age. If you kind of made a word cloud of all of the various sorts of names and titles which are associated with the figure in the New Testament, as those studies show, the language is both pervasive. There's scarcely a book of the New Testament where some version of it doesn't appear,
Okay.
and it's not, and as they argue too, it's not just incidental in the way that I don't know the word and is pervasive because it's just a kind of feature of the language. So it's pervasive, but also meaningfully so. They argue, not just as a kind of incidental feature of general language. So yeah, and the contrast is striking. It's very striking, and of course, scholars. I'm scarcely the first one to have thought about this. Scholars are presented with that distribution, and they have a question, right? Why is it the case that this kind of way of speaking and thinking about the world, the situation of the people of God, the work of God in Christ, the nature of salvation? Why is it that in the New Testament this theme and its figure should be so prominent when in the in the longer accumulated body of Israel's witness, the figure is largely absent? Like, what accounts for this change, right? It's an important question. There are registers in which to answer it, historical registers, the possibility of the influence and experience of exile and Babylon. So the idea, one of the ideas that scholars for a long time thought was important was the notion that Israelites in exile in Babylon would have been exposed to Zoroastrianism as a practice of Persian religion there, and that Zoroastrianism is a strongly dualistic faith, which has an evil god and a good god locked in a kind of titanic struggle, and that elements of that dualism might well have kind of been taken up, integrated, adapted for purposes of Israel's own kind of life and self-reflecting and faith and so on. So yeah, there are possible kind of historical accounts as to where some of this comes from, but it is super striking when you look at the statistical distribution, just how concentrated and ubiquitous across the pages of the New Testament is discourse about the devil in all of its various modes.
Do you see the intertestamental period? Do you see some of this transition of nothing
You,
to lots? Like,
yes, you do. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, of course you do. So that the more immediate precursors to the New Testamental use, intertestamental texts, which are closer in the grammar with which these figures are written about, the characterization of the as a firm opponent of God rather than a kind of servile member of the heavenly court. That shift, you see that most certainly. The Enoch corpus is the primary place where that emerges. You have a cluster of different figures, Mistema and others, who are much closer in their shape and action and identity and opposition to the work of God and the people of God as the devil figures in the New Testament. Yeah, so there are kind of precursors from the textual witnesses from the centuries leading up to the New Testament period for sure.
What do you see as kind of the threat to the church? What is lost if we completely? I know yours isn't, it's traditional, but it's also a little revisionary. But just in general, what if we lose a theology of the devil? What does the church lose? What does our faith lose? I
Yeah.
guess what's that threat if
Um, so I think my sense of that is yeah, has a couple of aspects. I think one thing which this work on the devil has helped me to see and be convinced of more firmly is that I think the primary idiom within which we ought to think and speak of the work of salvation is the idiom of redemption. That the shape and imagination of the saving work of God as depicted in the New Testament is first and foremost rescue, right? Redemption out from under captivity, um, captivity in this case to to a hostile power, right? In whose bondage we find ourselves and from whose power we cannot escape apart from the gracious work of God. So that this is that the human condition is one of captivity, entrapment, and that the work of God is first and foremost a work of redemption or liberation or rescue. I think that's become very clear to me. And the figure of the devil is one of the key figures in the New Testament witness that helps to bring that out, right? One of the ways we could talk about this is to say that um, uh, the New Testament will present us with an account of salvation as what we might call, as J. Louis Martin and others have said over the years, a three-agent drama, right? So the the dramatic, if you imagine it like a play or a story or a drama of one kind or another, the outworking of salvation involves God, it involves people of God, and it also involves this third agent, right? The enemy of both God and God's people, in this case, the figure of the devil, and that the work of redemption, the work of salvation, is told and worked out as a three-agent drama, right? The drama in which the third agent holds captive the people of God, and is and from that captivity, those same people are redeemed, rescued, and won by the work of God in Christ through the power of the Spirit. So that redemption is the primary imagination of the quality and the shape of our salvation. I think is one of the things that we definitely secure when we recollect the figure of the devil. It helps us to anchor that insight, and what that means is that the account of salvation that concentrates on what we might call reconciliation, right? The kind of two-agent drama, guilt and forgiveness, right? God and the people of God. The people of God is breaking the rules, transgressing, incurring guilt, and needing to be forgiven for that guilt. That drama too is part of the story, no doubt. But um, uh, sense now, that theme of reconciliation, is embedded inside this wider, more comprehensive theme of redemption. So the nesting of reconciliation inside redemption is one of the things I think that we secure when we recollect the figure of the devil, and to put it the other way around, one thing which we might threaten to lose sight of, were we to let go or lose sight of the figure of the devil. Yeah, so that's certainly one thing. Um, I think another thing, and this is a feature of the book as well, a sort of smaller element of it. Another thing that we might lose is an imagination for the way in which the Christian life can be understood as a kind of struggle, right? Um, it's possible to imagine the outworking of the Christian life, the the work of proclamation and baptism and the Lord's Supper, the work of prayer, the work of formation and community service, witness, all of that. Um, it's possible to see that and to think of it as so many modes of resistance to the work and opposition of the devil. So it's possible. It becomes possible when the devil is in the frame, as it were, to to um, to reimagine that shape of the Christian life, the outworking of all of these things, as so many forms of, yeah, resistance. Um, and so the idea of the Christian life as that kind of struggle, I think, is also one of the things which this notion of the devil helps kind of bring up to the surface again. And again, without it, right, the sort of agonistic character, the character of the Christian life as a struggle, might not be quite so prominent in our thinking and self-understanding.
Did you say a word about this? And maybe you've already kind of been circling around it, but one of the most compelling parts of your case for me was starting to see the Christian life, the Christian conversion as a kind of exorcism,
Right.
which I was just kind of mind blowing for me and weighty.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think this has to do with what you're already talking about, the resistance and the struggle. But could you just say a brief word on how the Christian life is in itself an exorcism, and how the devil
Hmm.
figure kind of, I don't know, brings that out?
Yeah. Thanks. So, one of the things which I found most educational for myself in doing the work on the book was confronting this motif of exorcism. It's not a theme which is been prominent in my own kind of church life or career or experience, and it's again, it's one of those sorts of aspects of the New Testament witness which often preachers, and not just preachers, don't quite know what to do with, right? Um, and yet it is ubiquitous across the witness of the synoptics. Jesus is depicted undoubtedly as an exorcist, right? Um, and so it was striking to me to have to come to kind of confront that. And there's a whole chapter, the opposition of the devil to the work of Christ as the life, which is where the concentrated discussion of exorcism, is sort of handled. Um, what what struck me about all of that is, well, a couple of things. So one is that um, the the work of Christ as exorcist is always to kind of, again, it's clearly the language of rescue, right? Someone who's possessed or is understood to be kind of captive, right, in a situation of captivity from which the only hope is release, right? And the work of exorcism is the work of release from that captivity. Um, the nature of that captivity is the depletion of human life, right? When we meet people who are possessed of spirits on the pages of the New Testament, they are always what, outcasts. They're living in the graveyards. They're socially marginal. They've been broken out of their families. They're separated from their religious communities. The work of possession has isolated them, right? And and dehumanized them as a consequence. And it was striking to me how time and again, one of the consequences of the exorcistic work of Christ is, of course, to bring about that freedom from captivity, and that in each case, or in almost each case, the point is made explicitly how that liberation involves or leads to a kind of reintegration. Right? There's a lovely example of that. There's one of the passages where a woman who's been possessed for a long, long time is referred to in the text time and again as woman, woman, woman. And in the wake of the exorcism, the description in the text changes to a daughter of Israel. Right, it's a nice little detail, which I think kind of is emblematic of this transposition. Someone who was sort of anonymous, right, sort of outside, no longer described in a way that really knit her into the social and cultural world of her time and place, is in virtue of the exorcism reintegrated, right? Becomes what she is again, a daughter of Israel, and kind of inside the community. So those features were striking, and then also the other thing that struck me, which again is one of these things that you think you should just know, but somehow I had forgotten or had never noticed, is that John's gospel, in contrast to the three synoptics, has no exorcisms. Right? Jesus performs no exorcisms in John's gospel.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's curious. It's just a curious fact of the
Yeah.
text, and if you ask yourself why that is, one of the answers is that in fact John seems to conceive of the entire work of Christ as one great exorcism,
Hmm.
right? So commentators will actually refer to the saving work of Christ as it culminates in cross and resurrection as a great exorcism, and they do that because they have in mind a couple of passages where John speaks about, or where Jesus in John's witness speaks about how now the God of this age is cast down, right? So that kind of language, or cast out, right? Of the God of this age is cast out, and that language is the language of exorcism, right? But the scale, it seems, is kind of a cosmic or a total scale, right? There's sort of one grand expulsion, one grand liberation. Um, that's a powerful kind of image, for
Yeah.
the work of Christ as a whole, and it was striking to me to kind of get reacquainted with that and to see the way in which thinking about the devil helps to bring that up out of the text in ways which otherwise we might miss. Um, so now that's all by way of kind of coming on to your more immediate question, which is about the role of exorcism in the Christian life. Um, there's a New Testament scholar and theologian, Ernst Käsemann, mid-century German, who famous for his Pauline work in particular. He used to say that in fact the work of the life of faith could be described as a kind of rolling exorcism, and I think what he meant by that, and it's an idea that kind of comports with this vision of John, I guess, is that as he used to tell it, the work of salvation is a kind of exchange of lordships. So it's his sort of term for it, an exchange of lordships. Once we were lorded over by the adversary of God, cosmic enemy, right, who's held us captive, the figure of the devil, or in Pauline terms, sin with a capital S, or death with a capital D. These kinds of hypothesized powers. Once we were subject to their lordship, they were the ones that sort of held us in their thrall, and the work, the gift of grace and the work of faith is exactly to exchange that lordship, which is captivity, with another lordship, and that's the lordship of Christ. And that transition from one lordship to another, Käsemann said we should just call that what it is, an exorcism, right? The expulsion of the other power, right? And the reintegration of the liberated creature under the authority, the power, the saving power of the God of the gospel. So that language of exorcism, it's quite provocative, isn't it? It's a sort of evocative language. It evokes, of course, all the kinds of stories on the pages of the synoptics, and it also, I think, though, reflects that Johannine vision, which can imagine the entirety of the work of Christ as a great exorcism, and Caseman's way of talking about the exchange of lordships is I think a nice way to imagine what that kind of language might mean, and why it might be appropriate for us to think about the Christian life as a kind of experience of that great exorcism. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a beautiful and powerful picture. Uh, as I let you go here, Phil, just thank you for your time. Thank you for the book. Thank you for all the work behind this. And it's been a treat to talk to you. Can I just ask you in parting, what do you think it
Sure.
looks like now for believers to resist the devil, and particularly in this kind of post-Christian culture that doesn't even necessarily believe in
Mm.
one? Uh, yeah.
Yeah.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah. I think the work of resisting the devil um, is is I think for the great majority of us, the kind of everyday work of prayer and the saturation in Scripture and fellowship in the body of the church, the celebration of baptism, the gathering around the table, the celebration of the supper. I think these are the kind of everyday structures in which we own the redemption, which is the gift of God in Christ that constitutes the church. The means by which we remember that, and the means by which we are formed into those people whose lives um, testify precisely to that redemption, and so also to that freedom. Right? Take the exercise of one. I guess if I had to say it in a word, I would say that the exercise of Christian freedom is able to be described as, or could well be described as, in another voice, resistance to the devil.
Okay.
Right. The celebration of Christian freedom itself, its enactment in the world, the self giving for the sake of others, which is the shape of that Christian freedom is itself the repudiation of the devil.
Okay, I appreciate that. Again, thanks for your time, Phil. I would love to be at your SBL panel for this. I think it'll be very interesting.
Uh,
Hopefully you're getting good feedback already. I've already heard a number of people that I wouldn't even thought would be aware of it already mention your book. I think just because it's unique in that, I mean, it's not standing beside 10 other volumes in the last 3 years that are theologies of the devil. So, yeah. And
that's certainly true.
you're a good
It
writer. It
is
was easy to read too. Sorry, go ahead.
well, that's kind of you to say. It's an unusual text, to be sure, on an unusual theme.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to think that it will find readers, and I'm glad to think that as a kind of theological intervention, it might prove useful. So I'm
Yeah.
grateful to you for your interest and the chance to speak about it with
You
you
bet.
tonight. Thanks a lot.